Many thanks, Veronica. Many thanks, Father Aldo. Pleasure to be here and to join this illustrious group and this wonderful group of participants and attendees. My job, I think, today is to give a little bit of context to almost a legal framework, if you will, to the migration and migrant experience with a focus on human rights. So I'll get right to it, though I will do one thing that will involve a little bit of media. So we'll see if it works, and if it doesn't, I'll move on. Um, you know, 280 or more million people, almost 3.5% of the world's population, are today living outside of their country of origin. And while many migrants choose to leave their countries year after year, an increasing number of them are forced to leave for a complex combination of reasons: poverty, lack of access to healthcare, education, water, food, simple things, housing, or even today, the consequences of environmental degradation and climate change. And then, of course, the traditional drivers of forced displacement, such as persecution and conflict. These causes generate movement, which in turn brings to it inevitably a kind of confluence of challenges and realities. The journey from home to new home, from fear to security, from threat to safety, the journey of, in a way, uncoupling from past to future to integration is long, it's fraught, and can take a lifetime for many. And that very journey, both real and figurative, itself then becomes a stage for multiple levels of suffering and pain, discrimination, exploitation, marginalization, and more. And we've seen this play itself out over generations, of course, in the seas, in the deserts, in border crossings, in cities, in communities, in the workplace, and more. One powerful example that for me places this much in context, and we can recall here in the beginning of the Trump administration in not many more than 6 years ago, the administration caused then the forcible separation of then fathers from their children at the border, inflicting at the time multiple and real wounds on family, on individuals through the separation, through the expulsion, through the exclusion, and through the criminalization of men and children. And what I have here to share with you, if I can make it work, is a short piece that was done at the time. And I'm trying to get it here online. Unfortunately, the banner is in the way. And let me know if this works. But it's a case that I'd worked on at Catholic Charities, and we had finally were able to reunify a father and his son. And this is a brief report that I thought was very effectively done. And tell me, Veronica, if you can't hear it or if you can't see it. Can you see the image?
No, I cannot see.
Okay, all right. I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, yes, so that people and participants can
Okay,
open
okay,
it on their own computer.
okay, that sounds fine. So let me go back to this. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great. So the law of migration in general is really defined through a conceptual framework that focuses not on the state, but on really in the perspective of migrants, for whom the ability to move or remain is governed by many and layered legal regimes that often fit together and often do not. But international law fundamentally recognizes the right to leave one's country and to return to one's country, but not to enter a third country. So states and international institutions really view immigration as a matter of national sovereignty, therefore not as an individual right. National laws, as a result, vary greatly and incorporate in many different ways international legal standards, I would say fundamentally unevenly. And as a result, and particularly today, we see that states and the international community continue to enact and develop laws that protect, to some extent, relatively narrow categories of migrants, mostly refugees and torture survivors, and offer very little protection, very little imagination, in a sense, to other equally desperate migrants, including those who have migrated for a mix of reasons, which today are evolving. And in this way, I would say forced migration or the experience of the migrant truly exposes the failure of states to live up to their responsibilities, really to show imagination, to show a way forward to solutions. Forced migrants typically originate in states that are unable or unwilling to provide the conditions that allow them to remain at home, much less to flourish, and then transit through states that do very little to protect them. States of resettlement or of destination then treat migrants as either lawless or a social burden and a threat, an existential threat, which in turn, I think, leads to some extent, the conversation today as language, rhetoric, discourse degenerates, influences public opinion, and then in turn can lead to wild legislative ideas, if not paralysis, and policies that tend to mostly expel and exclude human beings, which leads to vulnerability. And while migration, in a sense, can be a positive and empowering experience for many, it is increasingly clear that a lack of a human rights-based migration governance at the global and the national levels is leading to a routine violation of migrants' rights who are in transit, migrants who are at borders, and migrants who make their ways into countries where they seek to resettle. Migrants aren't inherently vulnerable, but they can become vulnerable to human rights violations. In irregular situations, they become disproportionately vulnerable to discrimination, exploitation, and marginalization. And these that we can then call human rights violations can include civil and political rights, such as arbitrary detention, torture, lack of due process, or economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to health, healthcare, housing, or education. So what is the usefulness of bringing a human rights lens or consciousness or perspective to migration? Well, by placing the migrants' dignity and rights at the center of their experience, at the center of their journey from home to new home, requires states, in theory, to examine how their action or their inaction can diminish that dignity or cancel rights. Modern human rights law has originated with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, where the principal architects of that declaration came from various religious and philosophical traditions, but shared a belief in equal dignity, rights, and the moral freedom of human beings. And of particular relevance to the forcibly displaced, the Universal Declaration recognizes a shared universal belief that all people are entitled to a host of rights without distinction, to recognition as people under the law, to freedom of movement and residence within their state, the freedom to leave and to return to their countries of residence, importantly, asylum from persecution, and nationality, which cannot be arbitrarily deprived. So, how are human rights defined, and who defines them? This picture, you'll note, is children on a train called La Bestia that traveled through Mexico from through parts of the Northern Triangle to the north. Who defines them? Well, in brief, really, there's these three instruments that are considered the International Bill of Rights. They're framed by, first, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then secondly, by the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted in 1966. What I'd like to say, though, interestingly, is in a sense that rights are very intuitive. And I want to share with you something that was written by a 15-year-old boy who had been a gang member as a young boy, had been thrown out by the gang, and of course was ostracized and vulnerable to state persecution in El Salvador. And so this young man was someone with whom we were working, and among other things, trying to place his own self-understanding at this confluence of suffering experience and movement to the United States. And we asked him to describe how he understood his rights as we were trying to bring him forward into his testimony before the court, his needs, and his sense of having been exploited and, in a sense, persecuted in the past and a threat of persecution in the future by the gang. And incredibly beautifully, this is what he wrote. He said he understood his rights to be, and I'm assuming most of us can read and understand Spanish, but I'll translate. I have a right to life. I have a right to work. I have a right to be protected. I have a right to family. I have a right to an education and a right to work. Interestingly, he said this twice. A right to be free, a right to think, a right to not be exploited, and then incredibly movingly to me, a right to love. And I think he encapsulates with the intuition and a visceral sense of life's meaning, the fundamentality of dignity, and of course, what we translate into rights. While human rights law informs the rights of migrants and the responsibilities of the state at the highest level, there are some laws that directly address and articulate these rights and responsibilities. With respect to refugees, and I'll be brief here, the centerpiece really is the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which has been enforced in a sense the longest and defines that term fairly narrowly as a person who, because of a well-founded fear of persecution for 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, is unable or unwilling to return to their country. And over the years, this law has proved as effective as it is limiting and limited, I would say, because it focuses only on individual persecution. It focuses on the state of mind of the persecutors and requires eligibility to be constrained or straitjacketed into these 5 narrow categories with no room for group determinations or victims of generalized violence or war or victims of extortion or victims today of climate change and climate displacement. 2 instruments that developed over time try to take a broader view. One called the 1969 Organization of African Unity Convention, and the second, the Cartagena Declaration. I want to go back, actually, apologies, just to say a word about the Global Compact on Migration, because really with respect to migrants, that's been the most significant development. Though it is not enforceable, it is a commitment that states have made to honor and move forward certain solutions and a holistic view to the care of migrants in transit in their journey of movement. The Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Regular Migration is really the first intergovernmental agreement, and again, it was prepared on the auspices of the United Nations, that covers all dimensions of international migration. It was adopted in 2018 and really uses as its foundation the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It lists, importantly, and I think it's worth reading, 23 objectives for state action. And those objectives can be seen as commitments and actions that serve as guides for states to meet their human rights obligations when designing migration governance measures and reduce always the vulnerabilities that migrants face. And I think of what they do really in the three phases of the migrant experience. One, at the place of root causes, to work to minimize the drivers and the structural factors that compel migration. Two, in the experience of transit, to reduce migration vulnerabilities and save lives, whether again it's in the desert, at the border, or in the sea, to prevent and eradicate trafficking and detention only as a last resort. And then third, in the welcoming and integration phase, if we can call it that, to have nations expand, again, with imagination and creativity, legal pathways to provide access to basic services to all immigrants, and in the broadest sense, to allow immigrants and migrants to fully contribute to the sustainable development in their new countries, right? Migrants come to produce, to make, to grow, not just to take, which is obviously the public perception. Migrants in transit are in a particularly precarious, if not perilous, human rights situation. And I'm just going to walk through a few of the sort of typical features, in a sense, of vulnerabilities in the journey to human rights violations. And the ones in transit in this picture here, I think, captures this very powerfully. Even as technological advances have made travel faster and safer, for many migrants who've been compelled to move, the journey is long and dangerous and in a way multi-directional. And there's really no certain knowledge between steps on that journey. And what's happened, I think, is that international borders have become a little bit of a no man's land, as a zone of exclusion where we can forget or abandon human rights obligations. States do certainly have the prerogative to govern migration within their jurisdiction, but they have to do this in conformity with human rights obligations. This means that the human rights of all migrants, regardless of nationality, regardless of how they arrive at the border, where they come from, or what they look like, are entitled to enjoy human rights. And it means, therefore, individual assessments at the border and a prohibition on collective expulsion and refoulement. Migrants in transit are at risk, including because they might become destitute or stranded in a transit country, as we can see here or imagine in this picture, which is, by the way, the most recent securing of the border by the state of Texas with barbed wire right on the Rio Grande River.
Mr.
Whether
Ross,
it land, yeah?
I apologize for interrupting you, but you have a few more minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Thank you.
Whether it land or sea, this experience is true and consistent, and states have a duty, three of them, to attend to migrants at sea, the duty to coordinate and cooperate with each other in the identification and monitoring of vulnerable people at sea. Two, the duty to respond to situations of distress. And three, the duty to disembark to a place of safety, which means accessing protection systems. Now, we saw recently in the Mediterranean and the Greek government that actually placed people at sea, and not to mention the US treatment of Haitians, right, at sea in the high seas in the late 90s, turning people away on the boats themselves. It also means that no one should be subjected to arbitrary and prolonged and discriminatory detention. It means that families must be given special purchase, right? A fundamental group or unit of society is the family. The family as honored in the Declaration of Human Rights, the right to and the possibility to live together, which leads, of course, to the care of children and the importance of children, both as independent agencies for whose best interest every state must particularly move and care, but also to be and in the care of parents. In the interior, we see the continual evolution of challenges. In the United States alone, in the past year and a half, we see 2.5 million people that have arrived and resettled, if you will, 170 or 180,000 in New York alone. What is the right, and what is right for those newcomers? You've heard probably in New York that they've dealt with shelter and placing people in what you see here, the Roosevelt Hotel. And an important step to some extent of doing what's right and of re-envisioning and reimagining what it means to resettle people in need. These are likely not refugees under the 1951 convention. And by our own study, we've seen that maybe 18 to 22% will be eligible for asylum under the 1951 convention, yet they are 100% people in need under a mix of varieties and factors. Workers at the heart of this in need of protection, the right to work, the right to equal pay, the right to rest, the right of a standard and adequate living for health and well-being. And then finally, to close, what is the question around the right of the undocumented? And again, we just recently released a report at the Center for Migration Studies that shows that after 10 years of decline, the undocumented population in the United States is now beginning to rise. It was at about 10.2 million, and in 2022 is shown to be around 10.9, if not 11 million. Next year, it will be higher. What does that mean? What does it mean for people to be in undocumented status? That is, frankly, a human rights and a humanitarian tragedy, not to mention, by the way, a political one. And I'll close with simply this, to say, Professor David Massey argues that the most serious task that remains for immigrant reformers is the legalization of the 11 million people who are currently unauthorized. And he writes that the lack of legal status constitutes an insurmountable barrier to social and economic mobility, not only for the undocumented themselves, but for their citizen family members. And not since the days of slavery, he says, have so many residents in the US lacked the most basic social, economic, and human rights. So what is right? What rights? Why? Aren't they illegal, as some say? Undocumented? Didn't they violate the law? What about the rule of law? And I think here we have to continue to be inspired and inspiring about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to belong, and to broaden that idea. And as Joseph Cairns says, moral claims to membership grow stronger over time. Growing up in a society makes one a member of that society. Thank you very much. I look forward to the other speakers and appreciate your time.